Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to class. In the continuation to what we have been doing in the series of founding fathers of social linguistics, modern social linguistics, today we are going to talk about another important and a great scholar, Dell, who is also considered founding fathers of modern social linguistics. Dell became popular for taking Chomsky head-on and coined the term communicative competence. For details on communicative competence, you can watch our video on communicative competence, and his major influential work on ethnography of communication, that is referred to as speaking model, where this word SPEAKING, the letters, each letter stands for a particular definition, a setting of the communication. So he created this acronym called speaking model. He was a young, bright scholar and a linguist who worked on a language that French Boas worked on in 19th century, and he completed his dissertation in 1 year. So today we are going to talk about Dell, a major contributor in the emergence of social linguistics as a discipline, and a founding father of modern social linguistics. He was also credited for an alternation in terminology of anthropological linguistics to linguistics anthropology. So we will talk about all these things in detail in this lecture today. So we are going to talk about Dell. I'll just go through the brief bio note of this social linguist, and we will get to see his major work, his contribution, his influence, and his theory of communicative competence that had long lasting impact in language teaching as well, and two of the perspectives, one by Dell, communicative competence, and one by the systemic grammar and functions of language by M.A.K. Halliday, shaped the language teaching method called communicative competence, communicative language teaching. So this approach in language teaching, communicative language teaching, derives majorly from the works of these two linguists. So Dell, born in 1927 and died in 2007. He was a social linguist, anthropologist, and folklorist. His work primarily dealt with languages of Pacific Northwest in America. Hymes earned his PhD from Indiana University in 1955 and took a job at Harvard University. Hymes had a very great reputation as a very bright and a strong linguist, and his dissertation completed in 1 year. He worked on a language called Kathlament, spoken near the mouth of the Columbia, and this language is primarily known because French Boas worked on this language in the end of 19th century. He became president of Linguistic Society of America in 1982. Then he became president of American Anthropological Association in 1983 and the president of American Folklore Society, and he was the last person to be the president of all the three prestigious bodies. Hymes was also a founder of the journal named Language in Society, and he brought out a number of very significant issues of the journal. He joined the Department of Anthropology and English at the University of Virginia, where he became the Commonwealth Professor of Anthropology and English, and from where he retired. So he first joined Harvard University and remained there for 5 years. In 1960, he joined the faculty of University of California, Berkeley, and served there for 5 years. Later, he joined the University of Pennsylvania and in 1965 as a professor of folklore and linguistics and of anthropology. From 1975 to 1987, he served as the Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. He left Pennsylvania in 1987 to serve on the faculty at the University of Virginia in both the anthropology and English departments. He retired from Pennsylvania in 1998 as emeritus professor. So this is a very illustrious career of Dell Hymes, and contribution to linguistics is immense, and the impact is still very much visible in all other works by a variety of scholars all over the world. He was one of the first person who made alterations in the term linguistic anthropology instead of anthropological linguistics. And this was not simply a cosmetic alteration, but the terminology shift drew attention to the field's grounding in anthropology rather than in what by the time was already become an autonomous discipline called linguistics. As one of the first sociolinguists, Hymes helped to pioneer the connection between speech and human behavior, human relations, and human understanding of the world. Hymes was particularly interested in how different languages and language patterns shape different patterns of thought, possibly closer to Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is popularly known as linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. If you look at the major publication by Dell Hymes, they include the ethnography of speaking, the language in culture and society in 1972, reinventing anthropology 1964, foundations in social linguistics and ethnographic approach 1974, language in education, ethno-linguistics, linguistic essays in 1980. In vain I tried to tell you, essays in Native American ethnopoetics, published in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania Press in 1981. Essays in History of Linguistic Anthropology, published in 1983. Ethnography, Linguistics, Narrative Inequality Towards an Understanding of Voice, published in 1996. And now I know only so far, Essays in Ethnopoetics, published in 2003. These are major contributions of Dell Hymes in the field, but it's not exhaustive list. He has published prolifically in all reputed journals, and here you can see a list of these, which are very selective list. Otherwise, list is very long. Like in 63, Towards a History of Linguistic Anthropology. In 64, Language in Culture and Society. In 66, two types of linguistic relativity. In 68, linguistic problems in defining the concept of the tribe. In 72, on communicative competence, which remains to be a major work and a major contribution, challenging Chomsky's idea of linguistic competence. We will talk about that very soon. Then, Models of Interaction of Language and Social Life, published in 1972. Speech and Language on the Origins and Foundations of Inequality Among Speakers, published in 1973. In 1974, Foundations in Sociolinguistics. 75, Breakthrough into Performance. 81, In Vain I Try to Tell You, we just mentioned. In 81 again, another publication, American Structuralism, which remains a very core reference document to understand American structuralism. And then in 1983, Essays in the History of Linguistic Anthropology. In 86, Discourse, A Scope Without Depth. And 96, Ethnography, Linguistics and Narrative Inequality. So these are major publications and major contributions which had deep impact on all kinds of scholars working in anthropology, sociology and linguistics. And he almost continued with a unique school of thought where the language, people's behavior, use of it, and the social environment and how they understand the world and see the world through their experiences became a core concern and thrust in research. Now, a very celebrated and debated issue about Chomskyan enterprise, Chomskyan linguistics enterprise is the idea of competence. And Dell took Chomsky head on, countering Chomsky's idea of homogeneous speech community and an ideal speaker-hearer, where he talks about linguistic competence and linguistic performance. He puts linguistic theory, the goal of linguistic theory to understand the abstractness and computational aspect of human language, right, and the tacit understanding, and he talks about universal grammar. So this abstractness was challenged by Dell, and he merges these two levels, linguistic competence and linguistic performance, and coins a new term, communicative competence, in 1966. So before that, let us look at what Chomsky meant and what Chomsky said. I quote from Chomsky 1965, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, published by Cambridge University Press, published at Cambridge MIT Press. I quote in Chomsky when he talks about goal of linguistic theory. Linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows the speech community's language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, random or characteristics, in applying his knowledge of his language in actual performance. So, if you look at the quote by Chomsky, he talks about an ideal speaker-listener in a homogeneous speech community. And the goal of linguistic theory is to predict and understand the competence, efficacy of the speaker. Performance has many restrictions, right? So, if you look at Chomsky's theory of generative grammar, that starts with three epistemological questions: what is knowledge of language, how this knowledge of language is acquired, and how this knowledge of language is put into practice. But Chomskyan theory focuses more on the first two questions. What is knowledge of language, that he adequately defines in this quote as well, and the second question, how this knowledge of language is acquired. So the whole idea of innateness hypothesis, linguistic nativism, the idea or hypothesis of language acquisition device, universal grammar, a tacit, uh, apparatus available to human child at the time of birth. So this abstractness was challenged by Dell, and if you look at the if you paraphrase the Chomskyan idea, what he means by that, he says a complex system and generative capacity miraculously develop with the help of an inbuilt language acquisition device. So he imagines a tacit apparatus. So LAT is that tacit knowledge that contains the tacit knowledge, and language is believed to be innate to human being, and this process is fast, effortless, and requires no instruction. It recognizes patterns, develops rules, and generates a perfect system called language. So this is how it defines language acquisition process, right? The tacit knowledge of the speaker who acquires the language because of the innateness nature of it, which is already available. The tacit knowledge is already available at the time of birth, and what he refers to as LAD, language acquisition device. In Steven Pinker's words, we are hardwired, a human child is hardwired to learn a language, right? And it results into body of language knowledge, and he talks about universal grammar, that is set of principles available to the child at the time of birth, and in the environment child sets the parameters. So this is what Chomskyan position is in generative grammar. Dell opposed this idea of distinction of linguistic competence and linguistic performance, this binary distinction, and he comes up with a new concept, a new term which he calls communicative competence. So he merges the two, and as a response to Chomskyan abstractness, Dell comes with communicative competence in 1966, and he underlines the inadequacy of Chomskyan theory and distinction between competence and performance. To counter Chomsky's abstract notion of competence, Hymes explained ethnographic details of communicative competence that included communicative form and function in integral relation to each other. Functions cannot be, he believed that functions, he argued that the functions cannot be separated from the form. The role of language is communicability, to communicate, right? So performance cannot be detached from competence. So the function of language cannot be detached and separated from the form of language. This is what he argued. So communicative competence is the intuitive functional knowledge and control of the principles of language usage. So he is making a minor shift where Chomsky segregated the two aspects, competence and performance. He is saying that the functions cannot be separated from the form, and as far as acquisition is concerned, we acquire the structures along with their functions. So he observes, I quote from Hymes 1972, page 277. He says, a normal child acquires knowledge of sentence not only as grammatical but also as appropriate. He or she acquires competence as to when to speak, when not, and as to what to talk about, with whom, when, where, in what manner. In short, a child becomes able to accomplish a repertoire of speech acts to take part in speech events and to evaluate their accomplishment by others. So clearly, he is emphasizing that the form of a structure and functions of a structure are not two separate entities. And when we talk about competence, it implicitly includes performance as well, ability to perform as well. So the functions cannot be set apart from the competence. In other words, a language user needs to use the language not only correctly based on linguistic competence, but also appropriately based on communicative competence. So when Chomsky talks about the tacit knowledge and the computational aspect of language, he talks about the functions of language embedded in the form of language. So they are not two separate entities, right? Both Chomsky in 1965 and Dell in 1972 use the term competence. Their approaches are different. Where Chomsky's notion of linguistic competence refers to the tacit knowledge of language that subsumes formal linguistics and linguistic subsystems such as phonological, morphological, syntactic, and semantic. And Hymes' position extends beyond and includes in it sociolinguistic competence, the actual knowledge and the ability of the language user that govern successful use in an appropriate socio-cultural context. So the function of language and the form of language merged into one, and this is what we acquire when we say acquisition of language. This is what Delheims argues. Delheims' contribution to modern sociolinguistics, uh, you know, remains his speaking model. We have done a separate video. Watch the lecture on communicative competence to know more about it, and we have also done a separate lecture on speaking model. So you can go through that. But the speaking model, speaking is an acronym where each letter used in the word speaking stands for something. What is that? So S stands for setting and scene, P stands for participants, E stands for ends, A stands for act sequence, K stands for key, I stands for instrumentalities, N stands for norms, and G stands for genre. So he came up with this speaking model. He came up with this acronym. Earlier in the ethnography of communication, he has 16 elements, such elements, which were compressed into these 8, and he coined this term speaking model, which became the guideline and a set of instructions for people or the scholars working in the field and collecting data. So he devised a well-known heuristic for attending the functions of the aspects of communicative events in cultural context, and this model remains very important for the researchers and the field workers who are working into anthropology and sociology and linguistics, equally important for them. So if you look at the contribution of Hymes in shaping the discipline of social linguistics, it is very deep and highly influential. During his illustrious career, and I keep on repeating, 1960s, the decade, it's so fertile, dynamic, and productive in terms of linguistics, and that this entire decade saw a galaxy of scholars and intellectuals working to understand the language phenomenon. Of course, Chomsky was one of them, but the technique, procedure, and approaches adopted by these scholars, uh, you know, are somewhat complementary. Though it looks that they opposed, but it is somewhat complementary, because as a third person, when we look at these works, it gives us a clear understanding of the discipline. As far as social linguistics is concerned, uh, Delheim's work grounds the understanding of language in a socio-cultural context. He is the one who brought anthropology and linguistics together, and he maintained a symbiotic relationship between linguistics and anthropology. He is the one who gave this term called communicative competence, which merges the two levels, linguistic competence and linguistic performance, into one, and argues against the abstractness of Chomsky's idea and approach, and advocates the merging of the two levels and acquisition. He redefines acquisition of language in terms of acquiring the grammatical structure, at the same time the function of it, where to use it. So the form and the function are merged into one, and he calls it communicative competence. He talks about socio-cultural appropriacy of use of these structures. So they are not learned separately, they are learned. So Chomsky calls I language and E language. If you are familiar, we did innateness hypothesis in a separate video. E language, I language, internalized language, which is tacit knowledge of language, and E language, the performance, external language, the performance. Such a binary distinction is not tenable when we look at Delheim's work of communicative competence. His major work, The Speaking Model, remains a very influential contribution in understanding language in action, language in social context. He brought language, human understanding, and the worldview, right, our worldview, all at one place. They have symbiotic relationship, and he was the one who underlined this fact. So he remains one of the important pillars and the influential scholar which gave shape to social linguistics, and that is why we call him founding father of. He is one of the founding fathers of social linguistics. For detailed understanding of communicative competence, you can watch the video on communicative competence. For detailed understanding of his speaking model, you can watch the video on speaking model. And this lecture tells you the journey of Dell Hymes as a social linguist, an anthropological linguist, a folklorist, all combined into one, and a major influencer whose theories and approaches influenced the other works that followed after him. So this is it for now. Thank you very much.